Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm going to turn things over to Evan to present our guest today. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So this is really kind of fun. I love having students and former students present at iROCs, and that is what we have today. So we have Elizabeth Hill-Caruso, Lizzie. So she's a master's student right now in English literature at SUNY New Paltz, and she is a Mount St. Mary College alum. So she was the 2021 recipient of the James V. and Jane R. McHenry Award for Excellence in English, and she is aspiring to share her passion for literature and writing to future college students. And Dr. Witkowsky is an associate professor here at the Mount, so you probably know Dr. Whitkowsky, and he's currently the chair of the Division of Arts and Letters. And he also teaches, beside his first year courses, courses on modern American grammar and occasionally in an English elective or two. So this presentation that we're about to hear grew out of the Charles Dickens course that Dr. Witkowsky taught and Lizzie took in the spring of 21, when both were struck by the familiarity of passages in this novel from 1848, and were surprised to learn that each was reminded of a different work by the later author, Henry James. So they were curious about this, and their presentation is going to represent a joint attempt to assign meaning to this apparent illusion. So join me in welcoming our speakers, Dr. Witkowsky and Lizzie.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate you're taking time out of a beautiful afternoon to be probably indoors. I don't know about the folks on Zoom. I'm going to get us started, but we're going to go back and forth. I'll begin with a definition, if you don't mind. It's kind of an obsession I have. Our title coins the phrase Dickensian déjà vu, according to Merriam-Webster Online, sense 1B. This being the sense I have in mind. Déjà vu is a feeling that one has seen or heard something before. We call ours Dickensian because we were reading a Charles Dickens novel when we both had such a feeling this past spring semester, nearly simultaneously if my memory serves. Dickens, who called himself the inimitable, imitated himself so often that the air was actually thick with déjà vu for the entire 15 weeks of the course I was teaching and Lizzie was taking. This, however, was a special instance, what might with justice be labeled reverse or backward déjà vu. I'll explain. The course, the Victorian novel Charles Dickens, was organized around 3 novels representing early, middle, and late Dickens. I guess somebody list this first. So actually move this out of the way. Thank you. Representing early, middle, and late Dickens. And it was when we were only knee-deep in Dombey and Son, the middle Dickens offering, that the feeling presented itself. Dombey is a long book. Dickens is second longest, barely edged out by David Copperfield, approximately 1,000 pages. For those unfamiliar with the plot, Mr. Paul Dombey is a successful London business owner who at the start of the book is blessed with a long-awaited son, also named Paul. The remaining the first 16 chapters span the 6 short years of the sickly child's life and end with his death. The remaining 46 chapters cover a period only slightly longer, during which Mr. Dombey's initial indifference to his surviving child, Florence, grows into active dislike and eventually hatred. There is an ill-advised second marriage for Dombey, his first wife having died giving birth to the son, and because this is Dickens, a large supporting cast of eccentric minor characters engaged in numerous interconnected subplots. The toxic father-daughter relationship, though, remains the primary narrative. It builds to a painful climax, painful literally as well as figuratively, and then not so quickly concludes. As I say, we were only knee-deep in this frequently riveting, sometimes tedious story in March of this year, when Lizzie and I both experienced the sensation of having heard the same story before. For her, it was Paul's story, Paul the Younger's, poor tiny Paul, or poor little Dombey as he was often called. For me, it was the courtship scenes between Paul the Elder and his soon-to-be second wife, Edith, playing out at a fashionable resort town where Mr. Dombey had gone after his son's funeral that struck me as immediately familiar. It was déjà vu, but a reverse or backward déjà vu because it was stories by Henry James we both were reminded of. The Turn of the Screw from 1898 and Daisy Miller from 1878, stories published 50 and 30 years respectively after the story that was now reminding us of them. Clearly, it was James borrowing from Dickens and not vice versa. But was it borrowing at all? Was any resemblance between the works coincidental rather than intentional? In each case, was it the analogies or differences that most resonated? Such were the questions we had then that we hope to answer, to the extent that such questions can be answered today. Proving intent is no easier for literary investigators than it is for prosecutorial ones, but it surely helps to examine the evidence. Lizzie will get us started by reporting on what we know about James's at times adulatory, at times disdainful responses to the earlier writer's work.
I didn't know I could sit. Charles Dickens drew heavily from his own experience as a poor boy in London to paint startlingly affecting portraits of the London poor. In turn, Dickens influenced Henry James's art on a cultural and individual level. Because of Dickens' popularity and cultural intrusion, has anyone ever heard the phrase, "Please, sir, I want some more"? I could argue that Western fiction is influenced, all Western fiction after Dickens is influenced by Dickens on some level. One might ask, if Dickens's mark on literary history is so significant, what makes his influence on Henry James so special? In order to answer this question, I've gone beyond the text to examine each author's life in relation to the other. For class, we read a fascinating biography by Claire Tomlin about Dickens. So when I examined Henry James's life, the threads of Dickensian influence spread before my eyes like a spider web. Not only was Henry James influenced by Dickens on a cultural level, he was influenced on a personal level throughout his career. Arguably, the most memorable fact about Charles Dickens's childhood was that his father went to debtor's prison. I remember when we read Oliver Twist in the 8th grade, my teacher spoke of little else. I remember when after reading Tomlin's biography, I certainly don't think it's the most interesting fact about Dickens's life, but it certainly seems to have had the most influence on Dickens as a person and a writer. John Dickens, Charles's father, had multiple opportunities to live a comfortably middle-class existence. However, his abundance of children, his habit of falling out with his friends, as well as his inability to pay his debts, left the family destitute. In 1822, John moved his large, hungry family from the country to the filthy London streets. At 12 years old, after his father had pawned all the family's books and furniture, Charles went to work at a blacking factory. After blacking, or shoe polish, went into jars, Dickens affixed the labels by hand with other poor children from the neighborhood. This time in his life had a profound influence upon his writing. Dickens witnessed the utterly miserable, hopeless, and grotesque nature of the poor in London. When he became a journalist and then a novelist, he painted elaborate, devastating, and socially motivating images of how the poor really lived. Dickens grew as a writer during a period that hoped to reform a rigid class system and looked to improve the lives of the poor. Dickens knew how to appeal to the masses, so he became the voice of a generation who sought to change the world. In 1836, he published his first serialized novel, The Pickwick Papers. It may not be Dickens' most beloved book today, but it was his best-selling book during his lifetime. By 1843, when James was born, Dickens was a superstar. When James was born in New York City, Dickens had published 5 serial novels, greeted mobs of fans on his first American tour, and learned that he could get away with bad behavior because he was the Charles Dickens. I imagine Henry James's young childhood was saturated with Dickens in the same way that a childhood in the 2000s would later be by J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. In one of his memoirs, Notes of a Son and Brother, James articulates Dickens's influence upon children beautifully. How tremendously it had been laid upon young persons of our generation to feel Dickens down to the soles of our shoes. There has been since his extinction no corresponding case. No other debt in our time has been piled so high. People were crazy for Dickens. and Henry James willingly participated in Dickensian fandom throughout his life. Henry James was only 5 years old when Dickens published Dombey and Son in 1848, and as much esteem as I hold for James and as precocious as he undoubtedly was, I doubt he read the novel until he was a little older. But imagine what James's delight must have been to read about a disastrous shipwreck in the novel in which the bark Defiance, Henry James, commander, arrived in this port today, reporting the shipwreck carrying the novel's young hero. The name is merely a coincidence, but it is a significant coincidence. At the least, the book will have nestled itself more firmly in the back of James's brain, and perhaps it could have sparked his imagination to engage with the book on a deeper level. Undeniable that Dickens had an eye for mass appeal. Arguably, his art was secondary to his deadlines and his desire to reach a wide audience. In his basic comparison of the authors in 1950, Blair Rouse recognizes that Dickens's writing style employed well-tested methods of great popular fiction. On the other hand, James brought the attitude more consciously that of an artist. Because of James's primary focus on art, he both venerated and resented Dickens's appeal to the masses. In 1865, James wrote a review for one of Dickens's least popular novels, Our Mutual Friend. Bristling from Dickens's propensity for popular character tropes, James comments that the character, Miss Jenny Wren, like all Mr. Dickens's pathetic characters, is a little monster, belonging to the troop of hunchbacks, imbeciles, and precocious children who have carried on the sentimental business in all Mr. Dickens's novels. The Little Nells, the Smikes, the Paul Dombeys. James demonstrates an intimacy and knowledge of the Dickens library. Therefore, this, the poorest of Mr. Dickens's works, feels like a personal insult to him. James feels that he deserves better from Dickens, and when he's disappointed, he lashes out as a toddler might at an offending parent. Rouse is correct in saying that James sought to explore the nuances of humanity with a heavy emphasis on the art, but Dickens created the conditions in which Henry James expressed himself individually as a fiction writer in general. In 1869, Henry James went to London, where he became overwhelmed by a sense of déjà vu that resembled the kind Dr. Witkowsky and I felt while we read Dombey and Son. Looking around Craven Street, Dickens' writing sprang to life, and the whole Dickens procession marched up and down. The whole Dickens world looked out of its queer, sinister windows. It's important to note that The Middle Years was published the year after James's death, 48 years after the Craven Street experience. Prior to his death, Dickens's personal history remained unknown to the public, but by the time he wrote the passage, James would have had knowledge of Dickens's early lives on the streets. But in 1869, it must have felt rather like disconcerting and pretty wonderful. To put it in James' words, Craven Street reeked to my fond fancy with associations born of the particular ancient piety embodied in one's private altar to Dickens. The only modern parallel I can think of pulls J.K. Rowling back into the fold. Imagine you're a huge fan of Harry Potter, even though J.K. Rowling is very problematic, much like Dickens, and you're somehow unaware of the existence of the wizarding world of Harry Potter at Universal Studios. Perhaps on a journey to self-actualize, you travel to Orlando, Florida, and find yourself face-to-face with the universe J.K. Rowling created. I think it would feel wonderful, unsettling, and intimidating all at once. In 1870, after publishing 19 books and short stories and gaining both the love and enmity of a generation, Dickens collapsed at his home and died. By this time, James was an established author who developed a writing style that benefited from and engaged with Dickens's precedent. Months into our preparations for this presentation, Dr. Witkowsky came across an article analyzing a 1908 James story called Julia Bride. According to Adeline Tintner, it is James's only fictional tale that explicitly references Dickens. His titular hero, Julia, mirrors the beloved and sacrificial Nancy from Oliver Twist. She even imagines herself and her companion as Nancy and the Artful Dodger, talking things over in the manner of Oliver Twist. Dr. Witkowski's discovery of this new connective thread between the authors reflects our entire research process. The deeper we dig, the stronger the connections become. Scholar Philip Collins included several of James's letters about Dickens in his book, Charles Dickens, The Critical Heritage. In these letters, dated circa 1913 and 1914, James fondly recalls listening to his cousin read the first installment of David Copperfield. When he held his breath and listened, he listened long and drank deep while the wondrous picture grew. In his old age, James seemed to forgive the injuries of books like Our Mutual Friend and to forget the intimidation of stumbling straight into Dickens's London. James died in 1916, holding Dickens as his treasure so hoarded in the dusty chambers of youth. In 1917, James's autobiographical novel was published posthumously by the name The Middle Years. An autobiographical novel is a novel with elements of autobiography, especially one based on a part of the author's life. The text includes 2 finished volumes, A Small Boy and Others, and Notes of a Son and Brother, published in 1913 and 1914, respectively. The unfinished 3rd volume, The Middle Years, appeared for the first time in this text. James uses elements of fiction, half-truths, and a writer's craft to transform a real experience into a less real but more meaningful and consequential piece of work. In her article, James, Dickens, and the Indirections of Influence, Tamara Folini discusses Dickensian influence upon James and claims that this passage about Dickens engages with him on a meta level. She argues that James's ease with words such as socially sinister and his descriptions of dreamlike states rely heavily upon Dickensian precedent. Beyond that, he uses Dickensian language, syntax, and style to connect his experience to Dickens as an individual and an artist. Henry James interacted with Dickens on a personal, cultural, and artistic level throughout his life. Now, I'm going to pass the reins back to Dr. Witkowski, and he'll dig into the text of Daisy Miller and Dombey and Son.
Thank you. Introducing our topic, I explained our subtitle, but not our title, Analogies or Differences, which I'd now have you notice is in quotation marks. It is in fact a quotation from Daisy Miller, the earlier of the 2 tales we're reflecting on today. The phrase belongs to the story's 3rd-person narrator, who in the introductory paragraphs works hard to convey the atmosphere of a particularly comfortable hotel in Vevey, Switzerland, where 27-year-old Frederick Winterbourne is drinking coffee in the garden. If on one hand, because of the large number of visiting Americans, Vevey assumes at this period some of the characteristics of an American watering place, a Newport or a Saratoga, there are other features much at variance with these suggestions, not the least of which a view of the sunny crests of the Dent du Midi and the picturesque towers of the castle of Chillon. Chillon has its part to play in the story and indeed in my own remarks, but the point here is that the narrator claims hardly to know whether it was analogies or differences that his protagonist recognizes, looking around at a scene at once alien and strangely familiar. This was my exact predicament while rereading chapter 27 of Dombey and Son, in which Mr. Dombey and his future bride, Edith Granger, accompanied by assorted hangers-on, leave their lodgings in Leamington Spa to go on an excursion to Warwick Castle. Lizzie hadn't yet shared with the class the connection she was simultaneously making to James's later work, so it couldn't have been the power of suggestion whispering Henry James in my ear and prompting the connection for me. It had been probably 20 years since I last read, much less taught Daisy Miller, and 18 years, 8 months, and 21 days. Oops. Oh, you know what? I hit the wrong button. Apologies. Sorry. There I am in 2002 in Rome. When I had irritated my traveling companion by insisting that we search in vain, of course, for Daisy's grave in the Protestant cemetery. Yet there I was reading about Dombey and Edith, Mrs. Scooten, Mr. Carker, and Major Bagstock, making their tour of the pictures, the walls, crow's nest, and so forth of Warwick Castle, but picturing in my mind's eye Winterbourne and Daisy, 700 miles from south central England on the eastern shore of Lake Geneva, a full 30 years into the future. Having entered the most obvious differences of time and place into evidence, I might as well concede one other glaring divergence between the two texts. Daisy and Edith are hardly mirror images of one another, having significant differences in age, place of residence, family, and financial situation. Add to this the difference in comportment between the two during the scenes in question, and the former seems less and less a plausible antecedent for the latter. In the interest of time, let it suffice to say that Daisy trips and rustles and flirts her way around the castle, talking nonstop, while Edith seems as if frozen in place at Warwick and utterly silent. So unlikely a couple are Edith and Dombey that the very pictures on the walls seem offended to look on them. Most tellingly, a churchman with his hand upraised denounces the mockery of such a couple coming to God's altar. That's the picture formerly at Warwick Castle, now in Pasadena. If on thus examining the evidence, I had concluded that this scene from Daisy Miller bears only superficial resemblance to the prior scene in Dombey and Son, the critical record would seem to back me up. Others have taken up and quickly rejected the idea that James borrowed from Dickens in any meaningful way. In an article published in the Hudson Review back in 1955, Q.D. Leavis examines a passage from Portrait of a Lady that she says is indebted both to Dickens, this time Little Dorrit, and to George Eliot, who in Middlemarch constructively uses by extending and deepening an invention of a less profound artist. James's use of the same Dickensian original is instead parasitic, according to Leavis, diluted, sentimentalized, even vulgarized, picturesque instead of poetic. The assessment is almost laughably harsh. 30 years later, Adeline Tintner would put a considerably more positive spin on James's indebtedness to prior works, which she describes as making use of the accumulative energy of such works to clarify, intensify, and pinpoint the meaning of the situation he is inventing. Tintner, however, situates James' indebtedness to Dickens in his critical writings, noting the more than 50 occasions when Dickens is brought in as an example or used as a comparison. Lizzie's identified the one and only direct reference to a Dickens classic in all of James's fiction. What we are talking about today constitute indirect references, allusions, and I'd like to make a case now for the significance of mine by narrowing the evidence to three deeply resonant words, each memorably introduced by Dickens and echoed in, let's just say at the outset, complicated ways by James. The first two words are both adjectives, stiff and natural. Thanks to an online concordance of Dickens's work, I know that the former appears in Dombey and Son much less frequently than the latter, 17 as compared to 68 occurrences. But 12 of the 17 occurrences of stiff are made in reference to the same person, Mr. Dombey, driving home a point about his character that was probably clear the second or third time it was mentioned. About half the time, the stiffness is attributed to Dombey himself, about half to objects associated with him, be it his stiff white cravat or the stiff and stark fire irons that resembled him more than anything or anyone else in the room on the day of little Paul's christening. If the word is uttered in dialogue, as when Mr. Toots's friend, the game chicken, labels the financier as stiff a cove as he ever see, it's never in Mr. Dombey's hearing. In Daisy Miller, quite the opposite is true. Given how much shorter James's text is than Dickens's, the few times Daisy says the word, each time not only in reference to Winterbourne, but to his face, the impact is arguably greater, being so much more concentrated than previously. It happens not at Chillon, but in Rome, in the second half of the story, when instead of taking her side on the subject of walking out in public without a proper chaperone, he advises her to get into Mrs. Walker's carriage. I never heard anything so stiff, Daisy says, with a violent laugh before going her own way. The other two times she says it, it's to joke with him about the prior incident. Throughout, the dynamic between these two characters, playful and teasing on Daisy's side, earnest, often frustrated, and well stiff on Winterbourne's, seems plainly a step forward from Dickens's one-note portrayal of Dombey, a character who is mostly insulated from painful truths and who learns to bend not by degrees, but by an 11th hour, utterly implausible, about-face transformation. A similar pattern emerges when comparing Dickens's use of the word natural with James's. That the word appears so much more frequently in Dombey and Son than the word stiff is not surprising. Natural has 3 times as many senses, some of them idiomatic, and covers a much larger lexical territory. The 2 senses I'm interested in, shown here, are in Dombey and Son, a recurring preoccupation of Mrs. Scooten, Edith's mother, who informs Mr. Dombey within minutes of making his acquaintance that nature intended her for an Arcadian, that she is thrown away in society, that cows are her passion, and that what she has ever sighed for has been to retreat to a Swiss farm and live entirely surrounded by cows and china. Never mind that at 70, she still dresses in a style that would have been youthful for 27 and is pushed from place to place in a wheeled chair, not because she is incapable of walking, but in order to preserve the pose in which she had been sketched 50 years before by an artist of some renown. Why are we not more natural, she wants to know, when she is not bestowing the term on virtually everything she sees. As stiff had been to Dombey, natural is to Mrs. Scooten, part running joke, part blunted cultural commentary, in this case from her unnaturally painted lips, direct to our ears. The only time natural appears in dialogue in Daisy Miller, it's given to Daisy to say, as she attempts to explain to Winterbourne why she makes a point of introducing all of her gentleman friends to her mother. If I didn't, she concludes, I shouldn't think I was natural. If that were all, I would probably have to concede that there is no there in this case. Yet James's narrator also uses the word several times in reference to Daisy to communicate, for example, how Winterbourne feels to witness the girl's increasing notoriety. Overhearing her gossiped about, he felt very sorry for her, the narrator explains, because it was painful to hear so much that was pretty and undefended and natural assigned to a vulgar place among the categories of disorder. To my mind, the best evidence, though, that Daisy Miller represents James's revisiting of scenes from Dombey and Son, not superficially, but to extend and deepen the original, may be found in the third of the resonant words the 2 stories share, this time a verb, to know. Like natural, know has several distinct senses. Both Dombey and Daisy include common as well as uncommon ones, from the interjectional, you know, to evidence of recognition and comprehension, to knowing socially, as in, she doesn't want to know me. These are all Daisy's words again, in the final example, words that cut through Winterbourne's polite excuses for why he is unable to introduce her to his aunt. However, it's the sense that's missing from Daisy Miller that most intrigues me, given the prominent place it has in Dombey and Son, and specifically in chapter 27, where the excursion to Warwick Castle is bounded on both sides by a very particular kind of knowing. At the start of the chapter, Mr. Carker and Edith, who do not yet know each other, are both walking in a grove of trees when they are harassed by a withered and very ugly old woman who evidently knows them both, and who first offers and then threatens to tell their fortunes. Yes, says the woman, steadfast in her scrutiny and holding out her shriveled hand. I know. It's a strange moment, since what she subsequently calls out after them suggests a level of discernment that will be accounted for only much later when her own identity is revealed. In the meantime, it's Edith who articulates this train of thought when, after the visit to Warwick and 2 intermediary scenes in which she proves her accomplishments to Mr. Dombey, she is back at her lodgings and makes up for her prior silence with a torrent of words for her astonished mother. That's what she says. The Slave in a Market analogy, admittedly, reads as more than a little bit tone deaf 175 years after it was composed, but it's a fine bit of melodrama, a stirring performance piece, the theme of which soon assumes a finer point. Shall I tell you, she continues, who already knows us thoroughly and reads us right, and before whom I have even less of self-respect or confidence than before my own inward self, being so much degraded by his knowledge of me. She means Mr. Carker. Like the withered old woman he and Edith encountered among the trees, Carker knows, and his knowledge represents something more than mere understanding. Ever watchful, of course he sees, but he also sees through them, appreciating what they might hide from themselves if they could, never mind the world. Edith's sole consolation in all of this is that no art of hers has lured Mr. Dombey in. She has neither vaunted nor pressed the bargain. She has not, as she concludes with a flourish, tempted this man on. The pictures are from a 1983 television miniseries. The absence of any such compromising knowledge in Daisy Miller seems to me significant. Throughout, Winterbourne is like a man obsessed with knowing what he ought to make of Daisy. Were they all like that, he asks himself early in their acquaintance, the pretty girls who had a good deal of gentleman's society? Or was she also a designing and audacious and unscrupulous young person? 6 months later, he believes he finally has an answer, that she was a young lady whom a gentleman need no longer be in pains to respect. This is before their final encounter and before Daisy's mother delivers the simple message Daisy had left for him, a message he is still thinking about months after her death. In the end, Daisy is never truly known, not even today, not with anything like Dickens's usual certainty. James, on the other hand, was beginning to be by the time Daisy Miller was published in 1878. Is it a coincidence that when his contemporary novelist and critic William Dean Howells spoke of James's increasing notoriety during this period, the term he used to describe it was an exact inversion of Edith's phrase, not knows us thoroughly, but that James was beginning to be thoroughly known? Probably that's a coincidence. Even I would not suggest that Dickens's reach extends that far. And James's notoriety is of course different than Edith's or Daisy's, consisting at this point of a vague suspicion that this particular portrait of a lady is somehow less flattering than it might or perhaps ought to have been. By 1898, it's a different story, as Lizzie will explain.
In 1898, Henry James published The Turn of the Screw, a complicated, ambiguous, and disturbing ghost story revolving around a governess and her two charges, Miles 10 and Flora 6. Douglas, an old acquaintance of the long-dead unnamed governess, retells her story in a parlor room over 40 years later to privileged partygoers greedy for entertainment. In the story, oh, nope, that was wrong. In the story, the governess accepts a job caring for two orphan children at an isolated manor from their attractive, rich, and ambivalent uncle known only as the master of Harley Street. Upon her arrival at Bly Manor, the governess learns that her predecessor, Miss Jessel, and her lover, the butler, Mr. Quint, met untimely deaths preceding her hiring. Frighteningly, the governess begins to see the ghosts of Quint and Jessel around the property. Further, she becomes convinced that the children not only see the ghosts too, but have allowed the ghosts to corrupt their pure souls. In the process of trying to save the children, the governess traumatizes the young girl Flora, and quite literally scares Miles to death. By framing the narrative so unreliably, James invites the reader to engage with the text in the way the readers of Dickens are rarely called upon to do. The reader has to ask themselves whether they believe the governess, whether the ghosts are real, and whether her assumptions about others leads to Miles and Flora's downfall. My first Dickensian déjà vu moment while reading Dombey and Son this past March occurred in chapter 2 of the novel, when Paul Dombey Sr. interviews a wet nurse for his infant son, Paul, whose mother has just died. After accepting Mrs. Tootle as the new nurse, Dombey promptly changes her name to Mrs. Richards, then dictates the requirement that when those duties cease to be required and rendered, there is an end of all relations between us. Dombey's coldness and his disinterest in the life-saving nanny, Mrs. Tootle, singularly reminded me of a similar scene in The Turn of the Screw. The governess meets the gentleman of Harley Street, an equally cold and disinterested guardian, whose main priority is that the governess should never trouble him. She must take the whole thing over and let him alone. Both men devalue the humanity of the hired help. Both men seem uninterested in the daily lives of the children in their care. But the similarities in there, so I thought my déjà vu was cultural. After all, both novels concern an upper-class family in need of childcare during the Victorian era. But the further we ventured into Dombey and Son, the more plentiful the connections became, especially between the younger Paul Dombey and Miles. Literary scholar Andrew Miller uses Henry James and Charles Dickens as examples for his classification of the 19th century optative novel in his article Lives Unled in Realist Fiction. Optative fiction refers to the authorial examination of an identification with, often longing for, other identities apparently unattainable. In other words, in an optative tale, the author explores and presents alternative lives the characters could have lived. Through disconnected Dickensian and Jamesian examples, Miller identifies the authorial use of mirroring and doubling to present the possibilities of the unled life. In Dombey and Son, Dickens gives every major character at least one double that explores the possibilities of a different life. And likewise, in The Turn of the Screw, James presents doubles for each character as well. For example, Miles is a mirror to the Master of Harley Street. Interestingly, for our purposes, Miller's effort to define the optative novel through James and Dickens draws our two authors together again. The Miller's concern resides with the individual authors in the genre and not the optative mirroring James presents in response to Dickens. By analyzing Paul and Miles's characters in conjunction with James's intense, if sometimes wavering fandom of Dickens, it becomes exceedingly obvious that Miles is an optative mirror for Paul Dombey. Miles and Paul Dombey share the eerie character trait of being children who act like adults. After Paul's first term at Dr. Blimber's boys' school, the headmaster's daughter, Cornelia, reads Paul's end-of-term assessment, stating that it is also lamented of this young gentleman that he is singular, which is usually termed old-fashioned in his character and conduct. As only an old-fashioned child might do, Paul tries to remedy Cornelia's assessment by doing things such as stretching out his morsel of a hand and boldly shaking the doctor's, also Mrs. Blimber's, also Cornelia's. Dickens, a hopeless sentimentalist, portrays this quality in Paul as charming, heartbreaking, and an indication that a perfectly pure, old-fashioned child cannot exist in this cruel world. While many characters initially find Paul's nature unnerving, Dickens undermines their initial distaste for the boy when his health takes a final turn. Rather than retreating from the dying man-like boy, they insist upon giving Paul a final happiness by performing the end-of-term party for his anticipated enjoyment. Their utter regard and care for Paul's well-being and emotional happiness illuminates the true feelings of young Paul Dombey's caregivers. Paul's gentility, precocious staring, and handshaking are sometimes unsettling to the adults in his life, yet he remains innocent and loved until the very end. Even his old, cold, distant father acts the most humanely in the scenes with little Paul. Similarly, James transposes little Paul's premature adulthood onto Miles in The Turn of the Screw. The governess speaks with Miles in his bedroom, and she remembers how, a short way off, he held out his friendly old hand to me. In both instances, the hand-holding, which is a childlike action, becomes a signifier of adulthood. In Paul Dombey's case, he shakes hands with his guardians as if they are equals, while Miles paternalistically reaches his hand out to his governess. Notably, both gestures are friendly on the part of the children. The real difference emerges in the adult responses to the boys. As a result, Paul and Miles's old-fashioned natures achieve wholly differing impressions upon the reader. I skipped it. Little Paul Dombey, it turns out, is old-fashioned because he is doomed to die. Miles is destined to die because he is old-fashioned. Quickly, before we discuss Paul's relationship with the governess, Mrs. Pipchin and Miles' relationship with Paul's relationship with Mrs. Pipchin and Miles's relationship with the governess, it's essential to take a quick moment to understand the difference and point of view between the texts. Dickens wrote Dombey and Son in the third person, and while the narrator is by no means unbiased, the reader has no reason to believe they're unreliable. Unbound to a single character, The narrator provides the reader with a vast perspective of all the players and events in the novel. Dickens intends the reader to accept the narrator's account as fact. On the other hand, James only provides the reader with the governess's firsthand, re-remembered, and retold perception of distant events. Every event in the tale flows through the filter of the governess's perception and psychology. Paul and Miles's shared personality presents so differently because of how their stories are told, which is why James's optative response to the Paul Pipchin relationship is so compelling. Before Paul begins studying at Dr. Blimber's, Mr. Dombey sends Paul and Florence to the delightfully ridiculous Mrs. Pipchin's school. Dickens, with his patented eye for detail, describes how, at this exemplary old lady, Paul would sit staring in his little armchair by the fire for any length of time, adding, in those old moods of his, she seemed to have a grotesque attraction for him. Paul sits at the fire with his guardian and stares at her. She fascinates Paul on a scientific level, and he wants to understand the grotesque monster before him. On the other hand, the governess often perceives and interacts with Miles, a 10-year-old boy, in sexual terms. In yet another bedroom scene, the governess confronts Miles for leaving bed in the middle of the night. He explains himself to her satisfaction, but then something incredibly disturbing happens. The governess, remembering the glee of their renewed friendship, informs the reader that Miles bent forward and kissed me. It was practically the end of everything. I met his kiss, and I had to make, while I folded him into my arms, the most stupendous effort not to cry. Taken out of context, the scene reads like the first kiss between lovers. In context, it demonstrates how easily sick and predatory individuals can warp and reimagine the innocent behavior of children. After a formal dinner in which the governess prepares to confront Miles once and for all, she remembers how Miles stood again with his hands in his little pockets and his back to me. It whimsically occurred to me as some young couple who on their wedding journey at the inn feel shy in the presence of the waiter. At this point in the tale, the governess has terrified Miles's sister, Flora, to the point of madness and sent most of the servants away. It's impossible to know how Miles feels at this moment, but as a reader, it is frightening. This young boy, regardless of his corruption, is still just a boy who is completely at the mercy of the governess's warped perceptions. While Mrs. Pipchin in Dombey and Son appears to have something of the same odd attraction towards Paul, her attraction is grotesque and scientific. In fact, Dickens suggests that Mrs. Pipchin may be a witch, and Paul and the cat her familiars as they all sit by the fire together. The relationship between Paul and Pipchin, while undermining social hierarchies, bears no trace of sexuality. Henry James uses Miles and the governess to indicate what could have happened to Paul if he were under the care of a sexually repressed and confused governess. The interaction between the governess and Miles contains complicated layers of meaning and psychological intricacy that Dickens could never match, but the similarities in the scene remain unmistakable. In both instances, young boys act like adults in their interactions with female guardians. Paul sits in a little chair and Miles has little pockets, but Paul's face is old, and Miles stands like a gentleman staring into the fire. By characterizing the boys as unnaturally mature children, both authors create an unusual perspective of the governess-pupil relationship. Dickens pokes fun at this dynamic, while James emphasizes the unsettling possibility that an unhinged servant could develop inappropriate adult relationships and power dynamics with their charges. So this semester at New Paltz, I'm taking a class in African-American print literature. And a few weeks ago, we read an issue of the Frederick Douglass paper. It was no surprise to me that Douglass's paper would print a serialization of Dickens. So I was amused but not shocked to see the latest chapter of Bleak House appear in the periodical on March 11th, 1853. What utterly surprised me was the chapter's title, A Turn of the Screw. Let me repeat that. A chapter in a Dickens novel that James undoubtedly read is called A Turn of the Screw. Yes, a turn of the screw was a relatively common turn of phrase back then, which James does address in his tale. But by naming his tale The Turn of the Screw, James engages with Dickens by reusing the title and claims superiority by changing the definite article from an A to a V. Considering all the other circumstantial evidence, I would classify this discovery as the closest thing we have to a smoking gun. Perhaps James never had an original thought, but by creating an optative version of Paul Dombey in The Turn of the Screw, James elevates and transforms 19th century literature.
Oh, I did it again. I cannot push the right buttons. So I just have to just scroll down and present. Oh, yeah, it's gonna be right. The red one toward the end, that one. Thank you. Apologies. One of the critics we invoked earlier today, Q.D. Leavis, the one who found so much that was amiss in James's homage to Dickens's Little Dorrit in The Portrait of a Lady, and so much that was just right in a similar passage from Middlemarch, concludes that there are two distinct kinds of literary indebtedness, that exhibited by George Eliot and that betrayed by Henry James. It's a lovely bit of parallel construction, but are there only two kinds? Is there really no middle ground between exhibition and betrayal, between allusions that elevate and those that degrade the original text? We're both inclined to think there must be, that the relationship between two authors is inevitably more complex than either or allows, and that our readings of James's possible debt to Dickens demonstrates as much. With that said, readers will have preferences today as much as in prior generations, and it might be a fitting way to conclude if each of us said candidly and briskly which versions of these parallel narratives we prefer. To make it more interesting, we've agreed to withhold these final statements from each other until this very moment. So Lizzie, would you like to go first? Or? All right.
So unlike Henry James, Dickens was definitely not a treasure of my youth. I liked the stories themselves, but I found Dickens' writing to be long-winded, tedious, and frankly rather boring. The English teachers of my youth probably could have taught his work more effectively, but they didn't. So I entered Dr. Witkowski's class last semester, unconvinced that my opinion would ever change. I was never tortured with James in my early education, so if you'd asked me in February whom I prefer, my answer would have been an emphatic Henry James. Today, my feelings are much more complicated. I still find Dickens long-winded and sometimes tedious, but I also find him dramatic, hilarious, and entertaining. I must admit that as of this date, I am an official member of the Dickens Society. I have spent way too much time trying to compose a poem to my favorite Dickens character, Captain Cuttle, and I have engaged in hours of research for this project. I can say with total honesty that my favorite aspect of this research was rereading portions of Dombey and Son. Ultimately, I think James is the superior artist. His work is subtle, ambiguous, and memorable. After I finished reading The Turn of the Screw for the first time for Dr. Von Rost's Gothic Lit class, I spent hours on Google, looking up fan theories and like trying to figure it out. So it's clear that James has an ability to stick to my bones, right? And it was delightful and obsessive. However, when your 4-year-old son runs around your house shouting, "Oh, Charlie Dickens," and sings snatches of lyrics from the musical Oliver, the truth is probably revealed. Dickens may not stick to my bones like James, but Dickens resides forever in my heart.
I should have gone first. It's really no contest for me and probably no surprise. I prefer Dickens's version to James's. It's not that I don't enjoy narrative complexity and psychological depth. I do. There's also plenty I would have edited out of Dombey and Son if Dickens had entrusted me with the manuscript. Florence's relentless pining for her father's affection, for example. But chapter 27, to my mind, is about as close to perfect as a Dickens chapter can be. I value the Jamesian homage, if that's what it is, in part because it led me to a closer scrutiny of a chapter from Dickens I only thought I knew well. If not for Daisy Miller, I'm not sure I would have made the connection between the old woman, Mrs. Brown's ominous "I know," and Edith's subsequent angry monologue, or what she had to say about being degraded by Carker's penetrating knowledge of her. I wish it's true that when the magnetic attraction between those two that begins in this chapter finally culminates over 400 pages later in a French hotel where they have run off together, but not to stay together, Dickens hadn't felt it necessary to assure us that she was guilty of much, but not guilty with that man. Some things are better left to the imagination. James knew that, and I appreciate his comparative silence in such cases. However, in my heart, I still think Dickens wins this contest, and if James's story has allowed me to view Dombey in a new light, I also now know that much of the appeal Daisy has always had for me is its uncanny, dare I say, Dickensian familiarity. And thanks to all of you for patience with us. We were supposed to show one more picture. That's how they appear in the National Portrait Gallery. Different artists, obviously.
Thank you very much. We have time for just a couple questions. If anyone in the audience, I will hand you a microphone. Anyone on Zoom, you can either raise your hand or you can put your question in the chat. We will repeat it.
We send them into silence.
Thank you. That was pretty fun and great to see you. It seems like a first to have say the same thing that Kafka has through Shakespeare, right? Like anytime any politician gets fired, it's Shakespeare. And I wonder to the extent that that's just like you haven't read any other authors from the time period. Yes, I don't know. So I mean, so my vote would be for differences rather than organized persona who comes to the centuries worth of social kind of relationship. So every author must measure themselves against the thick. And I think that's true for critics of the. So I'm wondering in terms of to get to the question. So in terms of Dickensian déjà vu, is it déjà vu in terms of what social relations what fiction writing means in the time period, or in terms of I guess at the level of sentence structure. So is it Dickensian in terms of the culture, the text, or the sentence?
My answer is yes, and you could have added it. You could have added as many clauses to that question, and I still would have said yes, because I mean I do think that is the beauty of illusion. You know, if you know, the least interesting thing I think maybe you'll agree about talking about this was whether we could really have a smoking gun or you know be able to say with any certainty that that James intended to echo, you know, a much loved or sometimes loved and sometimes despised earlier work. And, you know, ultimately for us as, you know, 21st century readers, it is going to largely depend on how we feel about either author, but you know, it is also at some level a commentary on writing or on gender norms from the period, things like that. I don't know if you want to add.
I don't know. It was well
no.
said. No, I think for me, it was at first, I thought it was simply cultural. In fact, I said it in class, and then immediately after class and my anxiety, I emailed Dr. Witkowsky, and I was like, maybe it was just cultural. Don't take it. And but the further we got, it felt, I don't know, it felt like, it felt, yes, thank you, Dr. Ronarosk. It felt uncanny. So I think that a big piece is cultural. I think that a big piece is class. But I think there's something more there.
Are there any other questions? Let's thank our speakers again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much.
And we hope to see you at our next iROC, which will be this Monday at noon here in DC 218 or online via Zoom.